This is section 2.3, Modeling Linear Functions. In this video, we're going to go through an example problem that's really similar to number 31 through 34 in your book. It gives us this graph and it's asking for all these parts. So first, the question tells us that this graph shows the level of happiness, y, in percent of students after the number of times, x, that they visited the tutoring center. As we see, we have a nice positive slope here. Gotta love shameless self-promotion. Okay, and it's asking for all these different parts. Starting with part A, it's asking us to find the linear function y, where y depends on x, the number of times students have visited the tutoring center. All they're asking for here is to find the linear equation that represents this graph. And if you remember, the two things that we need whenever we're writing a linear function is 1, we need the slope, and 2, we need a point on the line. So to find my slope, I'm going to use my slope formula, which if you remember, is just difference in the y's over difference in the x's. And to do this, I'll need 2 points. So I'm going to use, let's use this point here because it's easy, just 0, 50. And let's use this point, 1, 100. And plugging this into my slope formula, I have difference in the y's, so 100 minus 50, over difference in my x's, 1 minus 0. This will leave me with 50 over 1, or just 50, is equal to my slope m. All right, and the next thing I need is my point on the line. Conveniently, I already have 2. So I'm going to pick this point because it's easier. And I'll plug it into my y equals mx plus b form. That might be a little easier in this case. My m is my slope. My b is my y-intercept, which I already have at 0, 50. So I can just plug those values into my equation, or into my formula, and get the equation of this line. So I'll leave the y as it is. Y equals 50 is my m times x plus y-intercept is also 50. And that's it. All right, so here's the function that represents this graph. We found that by just finding the slope and a point on the line, plugging it in, and got this equation. All right, moving on. The next 3 parts is asking us to find and interpret these values. So part B is asking for the y-intercept. If you remember, y-intercept is wherever x equals 0. So I go over here, or I could go back to my equation, but the graph's a little bit easier for this one. So I'll say, well, x equals 0 here. My y value is at 50. So when x equals 0, y is equal to 50. And what does this mean? Well, let's go back to what the variables actually represent. So my x values are the number of times that they visited the tutoring center, and my y values is the level of happiness in percent. So if you visited the tutoring center 0 times, that means that you have a 50% level of happiness. You're only halfway at your max happiness. So 0 times at tutoring center equals 50% happiness. Sad. That's okay, you can keep coming. All right, part C is finding and interpreting the x-intercept. So similar thing, x-intercept is wherever y equals 0. For this one, I'm going to go back to my equation and plug in 0 for y. When I do that, I'll get 0 is equal to 50x plus 50. When you solve for x, you subtract 50 over to the other side, divide by 50, and you'll get that x is equal to negative 1. All right, so what this would mean in terms of our variables is that if you visit the tutoring center negative 1 times, your happiness level will be at 0. But negative 1 isn't an actual value in this case because you can't visit something a negative 1 times. So in this case, the x-intercept actually has no meaning, or it's not applicable for this scenario because you can't visit something negative 1 times. All right, moving on to part D, finding and interpreting the slope. Conveniently, we already found that here in part A. So we know that the value of the slope is 50, but what does that actually mean in terms of our variables? Well, we go to what the slope formula is, and it's the difference in the y's, or remember what y represents is the level of happiness. So it's the change in percent happiness over what x equals is the number of times at tutoring center. So number of times at tutoring center. So what our slope represents is just how much is the happiness changing per number of times at the tutoring center. In this case, you can see that your happiness goes up 50% each time you go to the tutoring center. Good to know. This is based off actual data, by the way. All right, that's really it for this problem. So part A, they're asking for the linear function that represented this graph. We found that by finding the slope and the point, or a point on this line, plugging it into our y equals mx plus b form, and got the equation of our line. Then parts B through D, we had to find and interpret all these values. Y-intercept, just wherever x equals 0. X-intercept is wherever y equals 0. And we just interpreted them based off of what they told us the variables represented. Other than that, that's it. The concepts covered in this video are true no matter what pre-cal class you're in, but in case you're interested, all the problems referenced in this book came from this lovely book right here. Remember that if you're a Baylor student, we offer free tutoring on the first floor of Sid Rich. You can either make an appointment or drop in whenever you're available to get tutoring in pre-cal, calculus, and a bunch of other subjects as well. Feel free to visit our website for more information.